Police officers of Reddit, what absurd situation have you just happened upon and realized no one called the cops? I do mountain bike patrol in a smallish medium-sized city. Was just riding one morning just after rush hour and spotted a little kid probably 3-4 years old standing on the side of the road with no parents in sight. Stopped and asked him where his parents were and he just kinda shrugged. Called it in and some dude ran out of some townhomes across the street and said the little dude was standing out there for a few hours and he was watching him to keep an eye on him. There were people around and everything, but we never got a call for it. Long story short, he wandered out of the room him and his mom were staying in nearby and wandered out to the street. Place was a shelter for women and he was able to get out past the manager and a court police officer. Mom had died from a heroin overdose 3 days prior and when the little guy got hungry he got out of the room and wandered out to the street. No one even went to check on her either despite the smell. Edit. Because some people asked. I'll clarify, this shelter was not a homeless shelter. It was a shelter designed to house abused women and children temporarily that had nowhere else to go. Mostly it was designed to help bring them into the system by giving them a place to stay until their social workers and caseworkers can get them better accommodations. Kind of like a more secure hotel. The women were free to leave and do their own thing and there wasn't a full service staff like in a homeless shelter or rehabilitation facility. Edit 2. Thanks to the kind Redditor who gilded me. But please help out someone else with your money. It's starting to get hot out, so go buy your local homeless dude some bottled water or donate to a charity. Finally, please go out and push your legislators and the people in power to fix our healthcare and rehabilitation system. Many millions of people suffer from our lack of ability to help those in need, especially the mentally ill and the neglected members of our society. Push for the end on the war on drugs to stop the cycle. Not in LA anymore, but was for about 12 years in a large city. When I was a patrolman, I got a call about someone shooting off fireworks in a strip mall at 2 AM. These were common calls, so we would usually just go check the area and clear the call. I checked the parking lot and didn't find anything, but noticed the lights were on at one of the strip mall businesses. I won't say what business it was, but it was owned by a pretty prominent local businessman. Anyways, I got out to check and found the front door unlocked, which was suspicious. We had a lot of burglaries in that area, so I asked dispatch to call a rep for the business. I was clearing the building and found the owner and several other people, all really prominent, in a back room where a poker table was set up. One of the guys was sitting down and had a pile of coats in his lap, which was really weird, and he was acting like he was in pain. I saw blood droplets under his chair and asked him what was wrong. He broke down and moved the coats, then revealed he had a gunshot wound in his thigh. Long story short, these guys had a high stakes poker game every week and someone tried to rob it and things went sideways. The dude robbing it shot this guy in the leg, which some citizen heard and called in a fireworks call. The guys involved in the game weren't going to call the cops and were arranging to have a doctor come treat him off the books. Gambling is illegal in the state I worked in, but we honestly wouldn't have given it. We actually caught the guy that did it, but the DA wouldn't prosecute because the victim witnesses didn't want to testify or be involved. The victim recovered fine. One of the guys who I interviewed told me that they were robbed of over $30,000. So many. There's the usual drive-by shootings, gang violence, to the infuriating child abuse, child exploitation matters. Though to be completely honest, the most absurd situation in which no one called the police /911 was when my crazy neighbors across the street had their father-in-law have a heart attack on their front lawn during a barbecue. The guy's son was having the mother of all tantrums, shoving people, screaming, rolling on the ground, pulling up grass, literally broke a window dart all while shrieking at the top of his voice, "Please God, don't take my dad." The other relatives allowed this spectacle to unfold before their eyes while they formed a semicircle around this dude's seemingly lifeless corpse. I finally looked out my window, opened it, and shouted if anyone had called 911. Got around 20 blank stares. I called for them, and the crazy son tried to attack the paramedics while they were loading his dad into the ambulance. Called the cops for them too. Common sense really isn't all that common. Edit. No, the dad didn't make it. The party still resumed once the son got carted off in cuffs and the ambulance had left. The son was also definitely old enough to know better. He was in his early to mid 30s at the time of this tantrum. I'm really late to the party here, but 3 weeks after I started, I was on my way to our off-site property control, just driving through a residential area to avoid the congestion and take a look at my new beat. I drive past a house with smoke pouring out from the eaves and 2 guys watching across the street. They pointed at us as I stopped and said, "I think there's a fire." Think was an understatement. This entire house was filled with smoke. Windows were black with soot. And still no call. These 2 guys were just chatting away and not doing anything. I couldn't see fire, but it was the 10th of July and a sunny morning. No mistaking a house fire in broad daylight. So I call it in and try to gain access and yell for any survivors. Keep in mind I have 0 fire training, but have half a brain enough to know that if there are any survivors in there I won't be any help to them, and will just be another body to yard out once fire does arrive. I get into the backyard by jumping over the hood of a minivan and sliding across like a Duke brother because there is so much junk everywhere. This takes a piece of the wooden fence and jams my radio key button open, so everyone can hear me breathing, yelling for survivors, etc. I have no idea I've got an open mic at this time. I lay down on the deck and look through the sliding glass door and there is only about 4 inches up from the floor I can see. I continue to yell for survivors but get no response. As soon as fire gets there, they make a slow entry because the front door has been barricaded. This is when I knew something wasn't right. Suspicions were confirmed when firefighters yarded out 4 children, a mother and father. The father was the last one taken out and the only survivor. Everyone else, except an infant, had been murdered with a kitchen knife. Doing CPR on a child that you can see is obviously dead is something that will haunt me forever. I never thought I could take someone's life until I had to try and help a child that was murdered by his father. I've never wanted to choke the life out of someone more. Talking about it helps, but still hurts. I was off duty playing poker with some neighbors and friends. One of the guys at the table is a hard-ass Vietnam vet. In the middle of a hand he downs his glass of scotch, hits himself in the chest and lights a cigarette. He stands up and says, "Well, I'm having a heart attack." He then walks out and drives to the hospital. Everyone thought he was joking. Sure enough, he hadn't survived a heart attack. Started my 4 to midnight shift by heading directly to get to coffee. Beautiful summer day. People everywhere. I pull into the parking space and see a dude lying on the ground in front of a park bench. I jumped out of my cruiser, grabbed my first aid bag, and called it in. The guy was conscious but not really responsive. It sounds like a movie, but we were doing the old blink if you can hear me deal. The rescue finally arrived and took him to the hospital. I found out later on that the poor guy had suffered a severe grand mal seizure and was still post-ictal when I rolled up on him. The frustrating part was the dozens of people milling about that couldn't even bother themselves to call 911, never mind find out if the guy was okay. IO. Former Leo, worked a late shift and was driving home and decided to stop for some breakfast at Waffle House. I noticed a few people flagging me down as I pulled into the parking lot, which was shared by an auto repair shop. They point me to the back, so I pull over and turn my spotlight on. On the back side of the repair shop there was a dumpster, and there was a man laying down beside it behind the fence. I could see his feet. Then another homeless man walked out with a bowl and literally walked right by my car toward Waffle House. He was soaked BTW. So I walk over to the man laying down and he's unresponsive. I call in and EMTs arrive and the guy's dead. I still to this day have no idea how or why. I have the homeless guy waiting for me next to Waffle House and I ask him what happened and he said he was out cold. I was pouring water on him to keep him warm. Video from the auto shop shows guy walking and collapses next to dumpster. He wasn't shot or anything, so who knows? Heart attack, stroke, something. And for 45 minutes, this homeless man walked over to a water hose beside the Waffle House, filled a bowl up and poured water on him because it was slightly cool outside and he didn't want him to get too cold. Water was cold faucet water BTW. Literally nothing ever came close to the weirdness of that night in my entire career. My uncle is a cop and likes to tell us about how in the 90s in Philly there was an area so poor and ghetto most cops just avoided it unless there was a call. Well, that's where he lived because rent was cheap and he was a 6'3" 240 former minor league linebacker. Yes, it's a thing. Here, I've googled it for you since you guys apparently can't figure that out. Close bracket. He was driving through one day and saw something in a trash can that caught his eye. He drove back around one-way roads and there was someone behind him. He pulled up and looked for a few seconds, readjusted his glasses, looked, got out and walked to the can. Sure enough, he really was looking at a human foot sticking right up and out. He called it in. Cops were all over in just a few minutes. That's when some fat white woman and her very thick accented Hispanic boyfriend came out, both shirtless, her in a bra. The guy screamed something that sounded like "Hey nah huge it or frown dare who fucked HMMPS ranks the first part, which appears to be hey now you get away from there." That's when the 350-pounder 5'4" wildebeest came out charging the officers, scream crying to show some respect. While you run at cops you get a pair of bracelets and a timeout. So while she was in timeout they were able to get out of her that her kids were at school. Her mother was supposed to watch them. Her mother was a drug addict. Her mother OD'd. Her mother is now in the trash can. Obligatory, not a cop. A Leo friend rolled up on someone darting tree to tree in a pretty well-to-do neighborhood. Spotlighted the person just in time to see the young woman put a gun in her own mouth and pull the trigger. It ducked him up enough for him to pursue a different career. My father was a village policeman in the UK during the 80s. So this is his story. Lady bought a house and after many days, weeks getting settled, she turned her attention to the garden. She started digging some flower beds. But as she was working she came across some small bones in the dirt. Baby size bones. This house used to belong to a doctor. So the lady puts 2 and 2 together and assumes he was a child murderer or maybe did some of the book's abortions back in the day. This lady is shocked and terrified that her new home could be tainted by this horrible past. But she didn't call the police. Instead she just avoids the garden completely. The whole thing weighs heavily on her mind as the years go by. 5, 10, 15 years. I forget how long exactly, but it was at least a decade. Until one day she can't take it anymore and calls the police to report the bones. My dad goes out to investigate into the garden where she shows him roughly where they were. He digs around a little. This was the 80s and apparently they were less concerned with disturbing evidence, and finds not a dead baby, but a small plastic skeleton. Poor woman had been living with guilt and fear for decades because of a kid's toy. Pretty common where I work. No one calls the police. Probably the most extreme was a shots fired call. Extremely common. On a certain street that we really don't go down without backup. We drive through and don't see anything. Then maybe 10 minutes later we get an anonymous call about a shootout inside a vacant house. We find the door wide open, covered in blood. We make entry and find an absolute bloodbath. Blood, drugs, and casings everywhere. We recover an AK pistol that had been fired. There was evidence people had been dragged out. We only got the one call about it and no one showed up at a hospital later. Shot. That's a good story. Why was he hanging on to coats? Edit. Thanks for the gold. My first, and on a misplaced comment. Another one. I was responding to a disturbance call in a trailer park that turned out to be BS. As I was leaving I noticed a giant puddle of blood on the ground near a different trailer. Upon further inspection I realized that there was blood all over one of the doors, complete with smeared handprints and blood dripping off the doorknob. It looked like a ducking massacre. I started pounding on the door and this junkie comes out and starts yelling at me for waking her up. I asked her if she was hurt and she said she wasn't. She then proceeds to go apeshit about all the blood. She has no idea where it came from. I followed the ungodly amount of blood to a trailer about a block down where there is a giant party taking place. I ask the group of guys standing outside where the injured person is and they all go G-code on me and say they don't know what I am talking about. While standing in the blood trail, I push past and continue down the road towards where at the end of it I find a guy in what used to be an all-white outfit that is now dark red attempting to control his massive head bleed on his own. I later discovered that he had been trying to break into that other trailer when he drunkenly cut his head on the window that he broke out. My first year on the job, I was patrolling in a frat house neighborhood near a big Midwestern college. It was a Friday night on a football weekend. So we had our eyes peeled for any gatherings that looked potentially chaotic. Sure enough, We pulled onto one smaller block with a narrow street, where there were no less than 5 simultaneous keg stands happening right in the middle of the road. Several neighbors were looking out their windows with angry looks, but clearly none of them cared enough to get any of us on the horn. Good thing we stopped by, because several dumb kids were passed out and needed medical attention immediately. But wait, it gets better. Of the several intoxication arrests I made that night, one of them happened to be the daughter of one of my dad's best buddies. They had been roommates at that exact same college years before. That arrest, which wasn't her first one, caused her to get expelled from the college. And word somehow got back to my dad that I was the cop who had randomly stopped by and made the arrest. When I went to my parents' house for dinner the following week, my dad greeted me by beating me senseless with a pair of jumper cables. Not Leo, but investigate issues in child daycare centers. Staff members duct taped a 1-year-old toddler to a chair because they wouldn't sleep at nap time. One staff member witnessed the other staff do this to the child. 3 other staff saw the child taped to the chair. The owner saw it as well. No one said anything or reported to police. My office is civil, not criminal. I called the local jurisdiction and submitted all documentation I had found. The parent picked up the child and couldn't figure out why the child's clothes had a sticky residue on them. Boy, was she surprised when she learned what happened to her baby. Years ago, I was at a wedding, and the groom was a cop. There was a guest at the wedding who was the +1 of a friend of the bride. The reception was so much fun, with several hours of open bar at a big hotel. The +1 guest was walking around, inviting people to go out to his car to smoke a joint. At one point, he walked up to a couple guys and invited them, to which they responded, "No thanks. We're cops." Damn, that was a fun night. Obligatory not a cop. Went for a walk with my folks about 12 years ago. Small town. Went through a tobacco farm. Found a bone. Looked like a femur, poking out of the dirt road. Called the cops and showed the cop what we found. He took it. Not bagged. No statement. And said he knows a guy who can take a look at it. Never heard anything else about it. Not a cop, but this question reminds me of this absurd situation on Cops, where they get flagged down by a lady who says she got ripped off trying to buy crack. The best part is the end of the video with the surprise twist. Ex-officer here. Got called to a noise complaint and my partner and I knock on the door as it's actually pretty rowdy and could be heard across the street. Turns out there was a hen's night full of drunken 30-somethings and the cop stripper was running late. That took more explaining than it should have, but they eventually turned the music down. My coworker's story of how he found out he had a heart defect, I forget what it exactly was, jumps out to me. He used to ride his bike to work all the time at his old job. One day just on his to work he drops on the side of the road. Fainted. He was out for an hour or so before he came to. He was pretty beat up. Nothing major, but cuts and bruises everywhere. When he came to, no one was around him. People driving by. People walking around. No one stopped to help. No one stopped to call an ambulance. He went to the doctor and got surgery done for an artificial heart valve. This will probably get buried, but I'll share anyway. Finally getting some time to eat my lunch after a fairly uneventful evening. Pulled alongside a liquor store to enjoy my meal in peace. As I pull in, what do I see in my headlights? A vagrant with their pants down taking a it. Not the absurd part. I look down and see another person below him. He was hitting on his sleeping friend. I backed my car out and parked further down the street. Not a cop, but I was walking out of a baseball game that had just finished. There were huge crowds of people waiting at the crosswalks and a cop directing traffic. When the light changed, the cop realized that no one out of hundreds of people had pressed the walk button at any of the intersections. No one pushed the button. The cop berated everyone. "Isn't that what you're here for?" Everyone shouted back. I remember not long after I started, 9 years ago, a woman came to the police department saying she hadn't heard from her boyfriend in 3 days. She told me where he lived, and once I got there was no answer. I was able to gain entry and noticed the ripe smell of death. There was tweakerette everywhere. Stuff taken apart. Random tools and motors and all kinds of stuff tweakers work on. The house was near pitch black due to all the foil and blankets covering the windows. As I began to clear the house, I walked into one of the kitchen entries, and as I turned the corner I looked into a big wall mirror and saw the reflection of her boyfriend hanging from a doorway. His body was a death grey and his neck had stretched at least 8 inches. I remember having to pick him up and pull the belt from the doorway. That image has stayed with me every day since. There was a quadruple murder in a residential area here in Sweden back in 1980 with several witnesses that heard and saw the incident. The attacker shot a girl by accident and then shot another guy in the following moments. The killer shot a total of 12 shots over the course of several hours. Stabbed 2 others to death with a kitchen knife. He finished everything off with dragging the girl outside because he felt guilty for killing her so that someone would find her and call paramedics, but realized whilst dragging her that she was dead and nothing could be done. So he threw her down an elevator shaft. The whole ordeal lasted for 4 hours and no one called the cops. Even though 12 shots were fired and screams were heard. The killer was arrested 2 days later and was killed 18 years later by the son of the first guy that got killed. I have the Swedish police report if anyone is interested in reading it. Edit. Here is the police report. This was only a few years back. Driving along a suburban road one night and a guy wearing only his underwear ran up to our cop car and threw a very large sofa cushion at us. As we slowed down to find out why he had thrown said cushion, he tried to jump into the back of the car. We got out and had a chat to the poor guy who told us he had used about an 8 ball of poor quality sugar and wanted to get our attention to help him. Kicker was he had been running around the suburban streets all drugged up for about 30 minutes and no one thought it was odd enough to call us. To be fair, it wasn't the nicest area. My brother-in-law was on his way home from the night shift a few months ago and happened to drive past a house that was on fire. He ran up to the door, beat on it with no answer, broke the door down and ended up rescuing a woman and her children. I'm not sure how many kids there were. They were all fast asleep and had no idea the house was on fire. I wasn't on duty. I was driving to work. There's never traffic at this time, but I saw a bunch of cars stopping and are avoiding the lane up ahead. That's because an idiot motorcyclist had been splitting lanes when we were all going 70 plus when he lost it. Had his head go under the wheel of the sub and it had exploded. I roll up, get out the car, and some guy is like, he's dead dude, and I tell him no kidding as I call it in. Nobody else had. Not a cop, but my apartment got broken into a few years ago. It was one of those off-campus college apartments. We called the police, who came at about 4:30 am. Our neighbors were playing loud music, which was pretty typical for them. When they arrive, they are taking to the report when the officer I was talking to asked if our neighbors are always loud, and I told him it was only on Saturday and Thursdays and how it didn't really bother us. But before they left, they knocked and pounded until they finally answered. When they opened the door, there was a horse or a donkey in the living room, several studio cameras, and 3 or 4 people who were apparently filming a donkey show. I know those cops were probably expecting some weed, maybe a few minors drinking, but not a ducking donkey show. Literally just sat in my patrol car to start my shift. 11 PM 7 AM. I put it in reverse and back out of my driveway and pulled to the end of the street. Keep in mind the end of the street is about 40 yards from my house, so I make it to the end of the street. Doing my normal routine, I look up and see a woman running from the left to the right side of my patrol car, screaming and covered in blood. Little though process was what in the duck ass. Make contact with her. Boyfriend beat the it out of her. I promptly got M's to her and took the ducking trash to jail. One way to start a shift. I'm not Leo, but I moved out of Racine, WI in the 90s because in the last 3 weeks I lived there were 24 drive-by shootings, and 3 of those happened when there were already cops at the scene for unrelated reasons. I have a friend that passed his 10th year mark yesterday, which is I guess halfway to whatever pension adjustment pay increase comes at 20-year mark. Anyways, we had some beers for this mark and I asked him this question. He said firstly that it was in his 2nd year on the job and he was pretty comfortable with his current role, all the rookie mistakes long gone. I'll just say that this is in a downtown area in one of the 3 biggest cities in America at the time. He comes out of an Italian restaurant after a night shift meal and heads down a small alley length of the restaurant to get to his patrol car and hears whimpering. He hears "Oh duck, I'm coming." distinguishable by the tone of voice that a man is deaf about to nut, not someone running late. About halfway down the alley, he slows down and muffles his steps. He then hears, "Oh, I'm coming too." He's 99% sure it's a different voice. As he turns a corner, he sees one male hobo, balls deep into another male hobo, size who was balls deep into a medium-sized dog, cringes, both of them climaxing together and the dog, all facing my friend about 10 feet away from the edge of the corner. Pretty sure he got PTSD from all three of them staring at him, two of which midnut. Haunting stuff. Police officer in a very wealthy rural area. People out walking at night is not typically normal. We usually just stop, say hi, and ask if they need anything, then go on our way. One rainy night I was driving down one of our busier roads, still in the middle of nowhere, and saw a teenage male just running. He was clearly not exercising, so I stopped and asked him if he was okay. I asked if he wanted a ride somewhere so he could get out of the rain. He said he had gotten into a fight with his parents and was running to his friend's house. He was acting strange and it seemed that he was hiding something. I decided it was best to just take him where he was going and hopefully speak with an adult who could explain further. He said that was fine and that his friend's parents could explain, so he hops in and we go. Sure enough, I pull into the driveway and look up into the window. I see a group of teenagers, one girl and a bra. They see my police car and give me the "oh it" look, shut the blinds and start scattering everywhere. I realized this was an underage party and said to the kid, "Dude, why did you just have me drive you here?" He then realized what he had just done and he turned very red. Turns out his argument with his parents was because they didn't want him going to this party and he just ran out of his house. He could have told me to take him home, to Wendy's, anywhere but there, and I would have gladly done it. TLDR, I gave a kid a ride to the party. Not a cop, but I was listening to a podcast and they mentioned the bystander effect. Essentially, people are less likely to get help for someone if other people are around. Scary, especially when you hear the stories. Meal delivery service. They have an access code to get into the homes, for the elderly or disabled. Driver found an elderly woman dead. Called her supervisor, instead of 911, and then continued the route. I got the 911 call from the food delivery services dispatch and they wouldn't give me the number for the driver because they had already left and going back was not an option. Edit. I should clarify, she wasn't obviously dead. CPR could have helped, and not mouth to mouth but just compressions. It was a food delivery service sponsored by the county for the poor, disabled, and elderly only. There wasn't a for-profit motive to continue the route. The supervisor was fired from what I hear because the deputy filed a formal complaint for an investigation. Little late to the party, but my grandfather was working in his shop while I was there. I was maybe 8. He told me to go call my mom to come pick me up. He was having a heart attack and didn't want to admit or pay for the ambulance, so he got in his truck and drove off without telling me. I'm waiting there, confused out of my mind that my grandpa had just left for some unknown reason, waiting for my mom. Funny enough, he came back because he forgot his magazine. We find out he made it to the hospital because my mom got a phone call saying what happened. He apparently walked into the hospital's main entrance, waved his magazine and said, "Last time I checked, this isn't how I'm supposed to feel," and collapsed to the floor. He had a quintuple bypass. Nobody is supposed to live if they need a quintuple bypass. But the dumbass was reading his magazine the following week, pissed as all can be. Several fentanyl overdoses. Many people don't know that you won't get in trouble where I police when you OD. We're equipped with naloxone and take you to the hospital. There's a Samaritan Act that prevents us charging you or your friends with possession. My beat partner decided to self-dispatch to a fire medical call of a man who stopped breathing. He was familiar with the address and there was no other calls on the screen. Probably 2 or 3 AM. Anyways, as he got there, he realized that the guy stopped breathing because he was stabbed in the heart by his crazy girlfriend. No one there thought to call police. They just called it in as a medical emergency. Of course, I'm not a cop. I was driving home from work after a long day of severe thunderstorms pounded Kansas City. I was on the highway. Lots of traffic in front of me. Hardly anyone behind me. Everyone was moving to the right lane. and I quickly saw 2 smashed cars on the shoulder and car parts all over the slow lane. Not a soul even slowed down. It wasn't the best part of the city, but nowhere close to the worst part. I pulled over and checked the car in front. It was empty. I checked the second and the driver was drunk but otherwise uninjured. He said he crashed 10 minutes prior and I was the first to stop. But please don't call the cops. I wasn't interested in his request and called anyway. After I said, the driver reported he had no injuries but appeared and smelled intoxicated. The 911 dispatcher put me on hold. She came back on. Said all first responders were busy with flood rescues and they'd dispatch police and a tow when they could. And would I stay at the scene? After about 25 minutes sitting there, the driver walked over and if I'd drive him home. I said he'd get a leaving the scene. He just said, "Man, if they arrest me for leaving the scene sometime tomorrow, they won't arrest me for DUI. They got my car and my plate. They'll know where to find me. Duck it." Dude got a ride. I went home. Cops never called back for a follow-up.